The recipe for most social interaction is providing context. That's it. Language is our biggest gift, and people don't use it enough. So it's kind of like, if I'm somewhere where I don't know the culture or the norms, I just might say like, I'm so sorry, like, I don't know what is appropriate or not appropriate. Can you just give me some guidance? And then I look like more interested into that cultural norms, but we keep everything sort of internal. And because of that, people are making judgments. But yeah, if people could step into curiosity over judgment, they'd have an infinitely better life.
Today, guys, we've got someone who's been lurking in the shadows, watching everyone's blinks, 550,000 blinks to be precise, along with 25,000 hand gestures, I believe, and has done the largest behavioral study of poker players' behavior that there is, that in existence. He's been working, maybe he has worked with Phil Galfond or not, he didn't say.
Phil was the first person ever to reach out to me. This was like 10 years ago, and he sent an email and he was like, "Hi, my name is Phil Galfond. I'm a professional poker player and I'm very interested in what you're doing." Very Phil-like.
Yeah. Okay, so that's cool. I didn't know that he worked with you, so there's that. I also found what you were doing outside of poker to be very interesting, in that you were helping the communication become better when it came to workspaces and management, and helping leaders become more effective communicators and that sort of thing as well. And even you had some insights into dating and to discovering who's cheating on their spouses, which we should go into. But it seems like you have a very impressive resume and have been working with administered, well, I don't know if you've precisely been administered, but you're the founder of the Nonverbal Group, and you've helped run or been overseer, the founder of the studies of a lot of different studies on helping to understand nonverbal communication. And are, as you've told me, you're a professional poker player. You've played high stakes 2550 and 5100, which is pretty good evidence that this stuff actually works. So I read a couple other books on tells, and I have not been that impressed, to be honest. I read Mark Caro's book of tells and FBI guy's book on tells. I was not really keen on those. So
the
what
funny thing is, the funny thing is when I was playing professional, so I was a live player that learned to play online. So I was like on 2+2 and like all the initial training sites. And when I was playing poker, I didn't think behavior was valuable. So I just didn't really pay attention because of the stuff that I looked at. I thought was kind of like, quite frankly, silly, and just approached the game from more of a mechanic foundation, just like most online players would. And at that time, sort of the gap between online and live was so huge that just like, I really feel like some players that were struggling in like maybe 100 NL back in the day could crush live games because there was just such a gap in the knowledge. So then only when we did this study did I actually see the potential of behavior, and then see it more and more and more as I've worked with people over the last 15 years. But initially, I was a non-believer also.
So what were some of the things that you saw that convinced you that there's really something there to be looked at?
So there's this moment where I forget, we did the first study, and I was taking sort of this classic approach to looking at behavior. So I was like comparing a player when he's like, all right, like he knows he's bluffing here. He knows he's got value here, and like trying to compare the footage and not finding anything. Like, oh, like they kind of look the same. Like this, like what's going on? And then we went back and used a sort of a methodology called grounding theory, which is basically you take all the behavior, you code it, and then you see what the data tells you. And there was just one moment, I remember it was like 2:00 in the morning. I was with my wife and I was watching a player check his cards and bet like over and over and over again. And I was like, wow, like there's definitely something different here. Like the way that he checks his cards when he's top of range versus marginal, and the actions that follow that are so distinctly different. And then I started like, oh shit, like I think I took the wrong approach. And then I sort of had to forget everything I knew about poker and approach it more of a researcher, and just be like, all right, like what are the movements? How do we code them? How do we encapsulate it? And it sucks because back then I did it all manually. So now we have software that does everything. But in the OG days, like I had teams of like 60 people manually counting every single blink to see if like blink rate was correlated with something, or can we find something? And It was kind of a shit show, honestly. It was tough times, but now, yeah, software can handle most of this.
I can see how the blink rate might be associated with some things. Certainly, it's very hard to be 100% natural when you're bluffing and basically be at ease with yourself in all situations, and it can be messed with too. That being said, I think it takes quite some skill to figure out, based on people's micro expressions, to whether they're bluffing or not, depending on how self-aware they are. So why don't you tell me some of the examples of things that you found that were definitive, perhaps related to the blink rate? That would be nice. But also related to whatever else they're doing, like if they're sitting still or their pulse or whatever it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. So first of all, that blink rate study was pretty much a waste of money. Cost me like $160K to do, and the data was just, there's too much variance. So the first thing is, the most valuable part of the body is definitely still is the hands. The hands are the most used part in poker. They're required in poker. Contrary to what most people say, like the poker face, it's not that it's useless. It's just the higher level understanding of it. So like micro expressions in poker don't come up. Part of the reason is the level of concealment. And the way micro expressions are usually embedded is in conversation. And obviously you don't have to speak in big spots. So we basically bucketed this things two things. Like one, we found a ton of patterns in the hands and the way that people move their hands and bet, and the things that they do at nuance levels sort of connect back to their perception of a hand. And then the second thing was this concept of concealment strategy. So like so this is pretty fascinating, right? Like I think it was like, I had a deep run in the 5K 6 max and the main event. And I wore this special device that sort of measures my physiological arousal throughout the entire event. And like what I found in myself was that when I was bluffing and I was sort of like nutted, my physiological arousal looked very similar, measured by like heart rate, GSR, and a bunch of other measures. But when I was in a spot where I was like, I don't know, I'm all in with like top set, but there's a draw on the board kind of thing, I had way more physiological anxiety, because it was like my control issues of like, oh, I could still get the run out can be bad and I could still lose this hand. So I had like extreme confidence in some of the bluffs. I had a lot of confidence when I was nutted, but that period of like, I can't control outcome created a physiological response that would look like bluffing in me. So if like you were to look my behavior, you would say that like, oh, like when his physiological arousal is higher, he might be bluffing. It's not the case. And that's kind of what I found. So what I started finding is like, when you look at players, people like the whole like neck pulsing and like all that stuff, I don't really attach that much value to it. Like, even though there's a lot of like top pros that think that it has value and whatever, like the truth is, how people handle physiological arousal at the table is so different. And what we found is the concealment strategy, or the mechanism they use to reduce their behavior, is the thing that gives them away. So for example, like somebody when bluffing, like a lot of players usually use like these two concealment strategies. One is like absolute stillness, like they become hyper still in the spot. And the other I call like everything is fine, where they just sort of like act casual, like nothing happened. But then if you look like at absolute stillness, you will see that there's variations in how still someone is. So for example, like in a spot where a player is nutted, they might be like just looking around a little bit. And then when they're bluffing, they're dedicating more cognition or effort to not giving off information, which makes them hyper still. Like they breathe less, they don't blink, they're not moving at all. And then we look at all the examples of that and found like, oh wow, like 85% of the time when this person's hyper still, but this is where like a lot of people that don't understand the nuances of poker write books or try to explain behavior. But like you can be in a spot and be like, you could kind of like think you have the best hand, but not be sure and still kind of want to fold. Like this is multivariate right here. So sometimes it's like a more complicated puzzle than people want to sort of believe, but there's definitely stuff there. Like, I mean, and the stuff varies, right? So like I'll tell you something on you. So in mixed games, there was the queue with one client to like watch jungle post to like 8 hours. So like in mixed games, like you're getting a little lazy and post 8 hours of play. So like longer in a session, not in the beginning. So like in the beginning, your attention, your hand movements were described by someone as like sort of like sloppy. But the problem is because you were playing mixed variants, we couldn't figure out what's going on. So like you could be in a spot in PLO where you're like, yeah, whatever, I'll see a flop. But in Hold'em, it looks different. And then like do 7, it looks completely different. Like when you're playing more variations of the game, it connects back to your perception of a range, not just some like sort of basic thing. So like my big thing is like a lot of players approach this with such levels. It's like you would never say if a player opens under the gun, they have kings plus. Like you would never say anything like that. So like, why would you do the same thing with behavior where it's like, oh, if somebody's like neck is pulsating, that means like, no, somebody could have had too much coffee, not enough sleep, be really stressed by the physiological arousal of the situation. And that's leading to the pulsing neck. It has nothing to do with the spot, right? Like, and then also you don't know, like some of these players, like, all right, they're playing in a big tournament. They look really stressed and they have, 8 million in makeup and they have 10% of themselves. And that's what's causing this physiological arousal, not necessarily the poker. So it's way more dynamic.
All right. Yeah. What you're saying actually lines up really well to my understanding of things. We'll get to dispelling some myths in the first place. And by the way, I don't think I've properly introduced you. Blake Eastman, guys, professor, and also the founder of Nonverbal Group and master of psychology. Yeah, so I think there's some kind of way in which to interpret a lot of these things. I am curious about these other tells of myself, and I've noticed how a lot of my own perceptions and things have changed. At some point, I seem to become close to unreadable, I think, but we'll see. Just because I feel nothing in almost all situations. There are some exceptions, and I know how to like fuck with it a bit to make it very hard for me to be read. But yes, in my experience, you really have to know a lot of the context of what's going on in someone's mind and their circumstances in order to read them. It's not just about the specific things they do, like their pulse racing or whatever, but rather the overall picture and how it aligns. And like you said, actually, sometimes people try to conceal themselves and they end up screwing themselves over pretty hard. Like, yeah. I've noticed that there's some like really big tells that people give away, and it's mostly by them pretending to not give away a tell or trying to do something else with it. And they like they either pigeonhole themselves or they remove a certain part of the range they would just never have when they do this, or most people just never have. Do you want to give some examples?
Yeah. So what you just said is really important. So the whole notion of tells has been over-indexed or focused on the concept of feelings or physiological arousal, right? And like in the sense that like, oh, I don't feel anything in this spot, therefore I'm not likely to give anything off. And there's sort of two misconceptions with that. The first one is sometimes you give off something, like you just said, that you're trying to reduce it or you don't care, but they think that it means something. And that results in manipulating the other person's perception to do something that you didn't want them to do. And the second part is most of the tells that are actually usable at the poker table have nothing to do with feelings and emotions. They have to deal with the cognitive process. They have to deal that with, for certain players, certain portions of their range requires different levels of thinking, or different lines require different things. And the patterns in that are richer than like this person's nervous. Cause talk to any like really high, somebody's been playing, like someone like yourself who's just have like this crazy career, play the highest stakes. Like you're not going to be like, oh my God, I hope he doesn't call, like, and your heart rate starts racing and everything. Like that's unlikely to happen in terms of at a frequency that's predictable. But you could be in a spot, particularly pre-flop, where you're just like, I'll play. And your regulation's not as high. And that shows that like, all right, Jungle's probably not top of his range right now. Like it's those things that are way more interesting and way more repeatable. So we're looking for like a thought process as opposed to sort of emotion, because emotion that's a whole other, like do like a 10-hour podcast on the science of emotion. It's just a more convoluted, weird sort of space. We all have different, emotional vocabulary, words we use, way we respond in emotion. So that's why I love the hands so much, because they're the only part of the body that are required to be used at the poker table. They have to be used every single time to execute actions, to make bets. And they're the easiest to find patterns in because you have ground truth, right? Like, you know what a player, you know what hands they have, and then you know what they do with the hands. So you're able to quickly repeat what's going on. Where like big post flop spots, like, I mean, I've seen players like literally take lines that I would think that like, this is absurd, but they're just so confident that the player is going to fold. And that's the reason why they don't have physiological arousal. It's not because it's just an overconfidence in their line, right?
Yeah.
So anything that's repeatable is going to be better, which is why like the way you check your cards has been massively important. How you bet, really important. And then, like I said, that concealment strategy that players use, it just shoots themselves in the foot too often than not. Right. And then also what's really cool too is some people are conditional. So it's like, especially in tournaments, right? Like I found players that day one of like a Triton event, like they are giving off absolutely everything and it's almost comical. And then once they hit the final table, they completely dial into concealment and it's like, not that useful anymore. Like pay attention to someone else because they're actually trying now. And that's a leak too, right? Like earlier on in the game, you could be giving off tons of information. It's just not about the final table. It's pervasive. It's throughout the entire game.
Right. Yeah, this lines up really, really well with my experience, actually. I think that people give away a lot more tells when they're not trying, to a fair degree. I still think I really, well, let's get back to me in a little bit. I think that the idea of like the hands mattering a lot makes a lot of sense to me because it's very hard to do a lot of different things with your hands or any part of your body, really, if we're talking about controlled movement, etc., when you're very nervous and all these sorts of things. And it's pretty easy to miss the awareness in that. Whereas I think that your face doesn't really give off that much. It's kind of evolutionarily designed so that you don't give off too much, or else people will be.
So it's actually interesting what you just said. So like from an evolutionary perspective, in a social interaction, your face is the epicenter of communication, which we have a good understanding of the controlling our face because that's how you navigate in a social world. Right? Like, so that's like what you just did. That was like a indication of social coordination. You went, and like shook your head, showing you that you pay attention to me. But at a poker table, it's the opposite. Like the social construct is one of which we're expected not to smile and not to do these things. So it's acceptable to not move your face. And because people have so much regulation of their face and they know they don't need to move their face, that's why you don't really see things like micro expressions or subtle things. I mean, you do see some, I'm not going to, so this gets more, right. All right. So let me explain this. This will be helpful. So the problem is like when you do a study, you're basically like, I'm cheating. Like I have a full video on a player and I'm looking at them nonstop, right? Even when I do research on opposition research, I like pull every game anybody's ever played and I have this view. But when you're at a table, you can't do that. Like you can't look at every moment, at every time, in every action. You have to think about all the cognitive processes. There's burnout. There's all these things. So there's like poker tells as a facet of research, and then there's poker tells as a facet of practical application. So it's like, yes, there are things that happen in the face, but what are you going to do? Be like, you're sitting in the one spot and someone else is in like the 7, and as soon as the flop comes, like you're going to see that weird, you're not going to see it. So the hands is the only time that it's like really like quote unquote predictable in my opinion, right? Like, somebody, it's their action, like they have to execute, right? They have to do something. So like, that's the other reason it's just a byproduct of efficiency. Like, and that's the thing that a lot of people don't get about tells. And I've worked with people that have literally played their entire life, like best players in the world, all of that. And when I start teaching this skill set, even they experience burnout because what they're doing is they're trying to do too much. Like you're supposed to be able to be efficient with your perception, only looking at like who makes sense and why they make sense, as opposed to trying to follow every single behavior at the table, because you'll just burn out. Like after 4 or 5 hours, you'll be like, oh, I'm tired.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. I mean, this is the case with everything. You can go down infinite rabbit holes, but you have to pay attention to which this information is most useful. Can you talk about a couple hand gestures or hand patterns that you've noticed? It can be specific players too. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
That were really, really telling.
Yeah.
And yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah. So first of all, a couple fun ones. There's never been a single player that I've looked at in my entire career, both in our study and publicly, that if they put their chip on their cards, it's not a tell in some sort of fashion.
Really?
And what I mean by that is people think it's like, oh, they put their chip on their cards. It's not the act of putting their chip on the cards. It's the way, it's the order, it's the duration, it's the speed. So like some players will like check their cards and like meticulously put a chip on them. And then other times they'll kind of like slightly drop it. And other times they'll completely forget. And we'll find like, oh, like meticulous, like somewhere top of range. When they forget, very top of range. And when they just drop, it's more of like a casual, like, I'll play this 7-9. I'll play this 8-9 suited. So that's been a big one. There's something that we found called the card apex, which is the duration or the length that a player looks at their cards, which sort of falls into a bell curve distribution in the sense that players look at bad cards quickly, good cards quickly, but marginal hands, they spend more time contemplating. So it's like you see, like 10 deuce, it's like, all right, whatever.
That's what
you
I was
see
thinking.
aces, they're aces. And then you see like, I don't know, 7-9 suited in a spot where you could 3-bet, but probably shouldn't. And then you start looking at your cards a little bit longer in terms of contemplation. So that's been pretty reliable as well. And then all of these just sort of like sequences, like one of the cool things to optimize for is just like the notion of intention. Like we found that players are more intentional on top of their range and they're less intentional when they're marginal or uncertainty, or they have some sort of uncertainty about what they're doing, but it could like manifest or look different ways. So intention could be a byproduct of speed. They're just making decisions quicker and their hand movements are quicker. It could be a byproduct of their sequence, but typically like players that have all these things where they try to like be like stoic, it's like kind of dumb. It makes them easier to read in a lot of ways. So like whenever you have to follow a specific construct, like, okay, I bet, and then I put my hands under the table. And then whenever you follow that, like you're using cognition to do that. And they're usually good for like, 4-6 hours. And then all of a sudden they like final table of like day 3 and it all goes to shit. And then they're just like this open book of information. So I see that a lot too.
Really?
Another thing. That's probably a big one. And then there's just like kind of some obvious stuff. Like this is probably one of the most comical like tells in like Poker Go specifically. And this is like post COVID, I was looking at a lot of Poker Go footage. And like there's a player that has studied and knows every single aspect of the game tree with the 12 big blind stack, but now they're like contemplating. It's like, it doesn't make any contextual sense, right? And like, there's been times where it gets more nuanced, where I'm like, what is going on here? And then I find out that like someone's got a piece of like there's more of a story there in terms of like what they're sort of juggling.
What the fuck?
Oh yeah, there's been like
That's
a little
scandalous.
bit of let's not call it collusion, but let's call it like protecting your interests or something like that.
I mean, it's
so
definitely
there's
not
a lot
fair.
of weird stuff there.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
and then there's also like
Get Blake Eastman on the case.
there are spots where you see it and you're like, this just doesn't make any sense. Like, why would they do this? Like, this makes no sense. And like, I'm not a tournament player, but I asked like 3 world-class tournament players, like, hey, like, would you ever fold this hand in this spot? And they were like, no, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. And then it's like, there has to be some other contextual dynamic that would allow that player to sort of do that. And then maybe sometimes it's just a mistake, but sometimes it's some sort of thing that, some sort of arrangement. I'm not saying people are dumping games, but like, oh, like if I fold here and this person this, like, I'm sure that stuff happens.
Well, you're basically saying that certain people are cheating, and at least at certain points in times.
I can't always prove, but yeah, I would expect things like this happen in high stakes poker for sure.
You could probably get, it might be realistic to get some kind of verdict in these situations. We might have to get Yeah, like I say, we might have to get
Yeah.
Blake Eastman in the case. Calling Blake Eastman. Like, is there
You
something?
get like me and like 5 players to see like what's going on in this spot. Like why are they doing that? Like, and it doesn't happen often, but it's something. Those are interesting. And also another interesting one, really like probably my favorite contextual dynamic is like let's say there's a high level player. I have found that certain high level players have contempt for other high level players. Like they don't think they're good. So like, because they don't think that they're good, they drop their regulation to certain players, but they regulate against others. So like, all right, like I have to pay more attention to this guy, but this guy sucks. But the greatest thing is they're all like the top, like 200 players. So it's like, whatever the metric is, like the top 10 player is like, oh, this person's terrible. And I'm like, I don't think they're terrible, but it's like that kind of dynamic.
That's so funny. Yeah, poker players do all sorts of stupid things all the time. You actually partly answered one other question I had, which is what are some of the cognitive processes that are a bit more detectable via tells? I mean, you guessed what I was thinking myself. I detect a few things myself too, similar to that. Once I had a big tell on somebody just because like people often don't bounce in the ways that they don't balance their thought processes very well. I personally actually balance my fucking thought processes. I actually sit there with a hand I know what to do, and I think about what would I do with the other hands, because I know that some of those thought processes are difficult to balance if you're like in a bluffing situation or just have a marginal hand. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes it's just like I fuck with it a little bit. Or sometimes even with a marginal hand, I'll make a decision to call fast in case. But I'll do it both ways, actually. I call fast with really strong hands too. But yeah, I don't think a lot of players think like that. Whereas they take a portion of the range and do not. They don't have that when they're thinking of the whole picture. They're trying to manipulate in one specific way. Do you have other examples?
No, I mean,
or do you agree?
Yeah, what you're talking about is like the context equation. So it's like their behavior in like some guy with a golf hat that's so excited to play the main event is going to be, and the thought process is going to be more repeatable and durable than the best in the world.
Right, for sure.
So it's like the best in the world, it's where the context becomes so decisive and interesting. So like, let's say you're watching another player that you've got hundreds and hundreds of hours with. We could start asking you questions about how they approach the game and how they view it to better contextualize or understand the behavior. So this is also when I do like opposition research, people don't always like my results because they're just expecting me to like find something. So let's say I look at like footage of you and I'm like pulling all the footage and I'm like, I don't know what the hell's going on. Like this guy, 40% of the time acts really quick in spots where he's nutted, and 40%, 60% of the time when it's a pure bluff, he's acting that. So I know he's probably regulating the speed of his thing. Don't pay attention to it. Like sometimes it's that read because it's not always this like one-to-one relationship. It's like, all right, look here, look there, blah, blah, blah. But I'm really fascinated. Like in a lot of the higher level players, there are periods where it just all goes away.
Really?
Like for whatever reason. Yeah. Like long sessions or, tournaments where it's the last of a series and it's like a big 50K or 250K. And it's like, it's just pretty fascinating where there's like these windows where you could pay attention and see information and other windows where it's not. And then there's also change, people change over time and do things differently that they did 3 years ago than now, kind of thing.
I want to ask you about a theory I have. I actually use a fair bit of psychology in my game, and it surprises me that in final tables, people give up and like kind of just become an open book. That's very interesting. I did not expect that at all. I expected the opposite for sure.
No, it usually is the opposite, but it usually is the opposite, but there are certain players that like, I always call this thing, when like a cat, like certain poker players for whatever reason just start to unravel.
Yeah. Like
they're just frustrated. Like all of a sudden they couldn't get 3 bluffs that they viewed should have went through and didn't went through. Yeah. And even if it's the final table, it's just like they check out and then the behavior becomes more relevant. I
think, and I have a theory a bit about those types of people, by the way. Certain people are going to be conditioned better for poker than others. Like I have the opposite tendency. I don't unravel. Like it takes really a lot for me to unravel. Like really a lot. A lot of lack of sleep is the biggest thing for me. Like if I start, if I lose, don't have enough sleep, like that'll like fuck up my game for sure. But pretty much nothing else does, actually, even most drugs. But I have a theory that when basically the more accustomed to various situations somebody is, the more efficient they become on the whole. And this is certainly true in poker, right? You can, their true nature is masked by just being able to adapt to various things. And as you get older, you're better able to cover for your shadow side, which is, in my opinion, okay, well, just comment out, just tell me if I'm in the baseline of things right. But the shadow side is the opposite end of the duality that you're strong in. Like if you're strong in logic, you'll get better at being, you'll have to practice being emotional or whatever as you get on, as you get older. That would be the case for me, or vice versa would be the case. For sure, if you're emotional, you would have to put in more energy and have more experience to become logical. That's my guess. But basically, I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse exactly, but my theory is that as you get more tired, at some point, your true nature will like come out a bit faster, and everyone has various like different forms of tendencies. So if someone tends to be the emotional side, emotional person, etc., and they have to really keep themselves together and put the energy together to play well at poker, they're going to ravel a little bit sooner than someone who, perhaps like me, who my normal basis way of being is just to be logical and just kind of basic. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, my wife owns a sleep optimization company called Sleep is a Skill. So sleep's a big conversation in this house. It's the foundation of cognitive decision making. If your sleep is impaired, it's, I at the end of, like, put it this way, at the core is you have a capacity for decision making. And then you have all these like barriers to that capacity. Right. So some people, when all of a sudden feeling a certain way, or they like at the end of the day, like, all right, to like go a little bit more meta, like our brains are these prediction machines. Like it's kind of trippy, but there's this theory of sort of a theory of perception called predictive processing, which is really interesting and showing that we used to think of our world as outside in, but the reality is it's inside out, meaning we're actively predicting our environment. So we're not experiencing reality. We're predicting our version of reality through our past histories of events. It's one of the reasons why humans are just so efficient. Like we can fill the gaps in, right? So the same thing sort of happens with poker in a lot of ways. I feel like where somebody is sitting at the game and an event happens where they feel lost. And sometimes this stuff is like routed in like childhood and shit. Like, you know, they feel like they have to prove themselves or assert themselves, and whatever it does, it impacts decision making. So it's like, I feel like everybody has a customized version of that. And as like a poker player who's playing with the same group of players, like you kind of want to take note of that, right? Like, for sure. Like I know the various factors that kind of impact these people. And those are the things that often, interestingly enough, there's sometimes where players, they're so unpredictable because they just don't give a fuck anymore that it's like, stop paying attention to behavior. Like just stop. Don't look at tells, don't look at behavior. Cause even though they have a marginal hand, they're still blasting every street. Like they don't care. Like, and that's important too, to know like when to attack, when not to attack kind of thing.
It'd be pretty sick if someone like did the deep dive into someone's background and decided to exploit somebody's trauma. Yeah. I mean, people probably do there's people probably do that accidentally. Sure. I think people have done that to me. Yeah. Accidentally try.
Without intentionally do it, but also some, you know, you work with these world-class players that pick up on, this is my big thing about tells. Like, you know, talk to people that like think that they're really good at like reading behavior or processing behavior or something like that. And the truth is what they don't understand is the decision-making process and the raw processing power in their head is so much more robust than they think it is. So when they start to teach it, they're like, oh, you see that person smile, that means they're weak. And they're processing like 18 other things that they're not even realizing. So usually like when you test people, they get the right answer, but they get the right answer for the wrong reason. So they're like, this player's marginal. I'm like, why? and then they just say some bullshit, and then other people hear it, and then they start looking for it, and it's like not true.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot. There's lots of false positives in poker. People think they've got tells and they don't have tells. I mean, I can tell you, by the way, one funny thing from my experiences, I find that people play better against me online than live. And I think it's because people just play more according to GTO in theory than they do live. And then live, they just have this, and that, and they miss the overarching tendencies that lead them in like one direction or another and become basically exploitable because of those overarching tendencies, and actually kind of delude themselves in that kind of way. That's my personal experience.
Yeah. But also, you know, you're a legend of poker, right? Like there's like, you're Jungle Man. So there has to also be like the fear or the aspects of playing with you live, as opposed to online where there isn't that sociability. They don't have to interact with you. They don't have to see you. It's kind of like
some aura game,
you know, sort of like an edge. I mean, it's what some of these really, like, listen, like you can make arguments. Like if Phil Hellmuth didn't have his brand, would he do so well at navigating certain fields? Like, I don't know, like people want to, like, I play with him. I want to go after him too. And I'm not a competitive person, you know, like there's a lot of these meta aspects that I think become more relevant as the game starts to get more and more and more solved and more people know like what to do in the right spot within a more defined margin of error.
Okay. I want to ask if you've ever had a study where you've measured like the gut of someone's, like, to make the right decision, if it's even possible to do this, because I'm really curious what results would happen. I personally think the gut would not really be that good at detecting. I shouldn't have given you a primer actually, but what were the results? So did you measure this? Did you measure the gut's ability to detect?
I haven't done like a large scale study, but I do that with every private client to sort of put them in place, like keep their ego in check. Because some people come to me and they're like, oh, like I'm already good at this, but I blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, let's see. Like, here's 60 spots, like go through each one and tell me like what's going on in each spot. And the problem is, you know, poker players are also absorbing additional context beside behavior, right? Like they're looking at like the norms and the things that are happening in the game, which they use to cheat and get sort of information on. But the best test of this is like post they play. So somebody plays like a big event in Triton and then like they don't actually know the hands yet. And I'm like, all right, like what were you thinking in this spot? Like, oh, well, he did this and this and this. And it's like, well, here's the hand. You were wrong. Like, and you want to understand the mechanisms of why they're wrong. I will tell you, I did do something interesting in our like, actually, I did do a study with that actually it's not a technical study, but like we give away like our first week free of our course and I give 2 videos and people have to predict what's going on. And I did find that, I mean, I ran this in like 2019. I'm curious what the results are now, but if people thought that they were good at reading behavior, they were actually worse because their sense of confidence sort of creates this bias that they're good at it. And then they're seeing things that are not there. And the more people that were like rating themselves, I think it's like a 5, were more balanced and more empirical.
That's so funny. That's so funny. That reminds me of, actually it reminds me of dating, and it also reminds me of workplaces, because I hear all this stuff of like, oh, like, hear all these things like, oh, I could, you know, you could size up a person really fast kind of situation. I'm like, oh yeah, you know someone's whole fucking history by having one conversation with them, and then, you know, this whole idea of like getting first impressions of people and making judgments based off of that clearly isn't working in today's dating market. And I was reading about how to hire people. I read a book, 2 books actually, about how to hire people that were like more logic based. And I realized, holy fuck, this is like way more complicated than I thought. Holy shit.
Yeah, it's massively complex. But what you just said is so important. So like that's why a lot of this body language stuff is complete bullshit. Like, oh, if someone does this, that means this. Like, it's nonsense. Like, the truth is people are infinitely complex, dynamic creatures. And what we study is perception over meaning. So like, I can tell you with like an 85% accuracy, by processing a team's Zoom meetings, who is not liked just based on facial reactivity.
Oh, okay.
And that's not because they're a bad person. It's because, you know what we look for? It's social coordination. So like people with low social coordination scores are not liked. So like if you're having a conversation with a bunch of people and you're like this, because you're not showing that they're paying attention, right? Like it's like, oh, nod your head, tilt your head. Oh, that's so interesting. Like I didn't hear about that. Da, 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 da. So we have models that just predict facial movement, create like a facial heat map. And what we find is this person is a wonderful, wonderful human being who was born and raised in Ukraine, an area that has a lower level of facial coordination. And because of that, people don't like them. Like humans are so stupid in the way that we make these like quick judgments about people.
You're saying something about they're raised in Ukraine and they were taught not to have much facial expressions. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have noticed that, by the way, in these Eastern European countries.
Oh, yeah.
They do not have the same... Like this whole idea, it reminds me, there's so many directions to take this, but it reminds me of like this, there's this culture that exists that a lot of people in first world don't realize that they're in this bubble of a weird culture. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
But there's a lot of things that happen. Yeah. It's just a lot of things I've noticed as I've been traveling around that exist in this culture that aren't really normal, actually. They're normal for this culture. Where it's like appropriate to be very expressive when someone does something, and as you say, be very socially coordinated. And this is this idea of like being socially intelligent or whatever, but it doesn't really translate over to other cultures in parts of Asia and Eastern Europe and a lot of other places. Like
anybody who's traveled internationally, like it's just kind of like a presentation. So like if I'm giving a presentation to a financial firm in New York City, I can show up and be like, my name is Blake, and I could curse and I could be like, fuck this and fuck that and do that all sort of spiel. In China, there's like protocols. It would be like, Daniel, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate you here. Like you acknowledge everyone. There's like systematic structures in place that make things different. And, that's what's so crazy about social norms and social interaction. So like every social interaction exists inside of this norm, but the norms aren't written down anywhere. There's no like massive, this is just things that you're supposed to know, which is like hard because if you don't know these things, it's like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, and it's really, 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 really fascinating. Like that's what I love. Like if you think poker is complex, poker's a closed system. Like a social interaction between two people on the planet is infinitely more complex than like a poker game.
I think that's true, but I don't think it has to be. I think that there's a certain lens. I think that there's a certain lens that in which things have been can be overly simplified, but this is more of a me thing, a personal theory of mine. But basically, if you take away, for example, this aspect of judgment, in a lot of social norms, one of my favorite songs is it's a metal song called Without Judgment. Basically would solve a lot of the problems of the world, in my opinion. Whereas if you just took away judgment and you're meeting someone from another culture, now all of a sudden you can just communicate. And if you just spoke the truth, to use these like very like things that don't complicate, these modalities that don't complicate things, it seems as though a lot of the social problems will be solved. And a lot of the issues actually come from like thinking you know something, but you don't, kind of thing.
I love
expecting people to always behave in your own culture. Okay, well, I'm glad you agree because
I totally
sometimes
agree.
Okay, go ahead.
The recipe for most social interaction is providing context. That's it. So like if I'm at a meeting, yeah, that's like it's the language is our biggest gift and people don't use it enough. So it's kind of like, if I'm somewhere where I don't know the culture or the norms, I just might say like, I'm so sorry. Like, I don't know what is appropriate or not appropriate. Can you just give me some guidance? And then I look like more interested into that cultural norms, but we keep everything sort of internal. And because of that, people are making judgments. But yeah, if people could step into curiosity over judgment, they'd have an infinitely better life.
All right. Well, I'm glad you agree because sometimes I think like, what the fuck's wrong with me kind of thing.
No, that's good.
I'm mildly autistic, so you know, but then at some point I realized I was just born with a clean slate. I don't have these like natural like inclinations like everybody else. So I had to figure things out of my own. And at some point I realized, oh, everyone's got their own little ways of doing things. And that to me, the superior way of doing things was to simply not have judgment. And I slowly realized even the judgments that I had were actually were often incorrect. It was very, very easy to come to these conclusions where you think that something is one way, but it's actually another way. And there's all kinds of different ways of being that people communicate in all sorts of different ways, and ways that people date, by the way. The dating cultures are not at all the same as they are in the Western culture, but like some things you can do in one culture can be very rude or annoying, whereas they would be, or feel like very fucked up or whatever, but they'd be totally normal in another one.
Yeah. I mean, so like one of the things that I'm building right now, so like autism is it's interesting because I hope, like, we talk about autism on a spectrum, but it's really like this multivariate, multi-axle kind of thing, right? So I've had a lot of so for example, like I have this video of this guy and this girl talking, and the guy is like, listen, you need to get that done by 5, right? And it's one variation. And then the other variation, he's like,
sounds like,
listen, can you get that done by 5? Right? And I'll show that to most people, and they'll clearly say that, like, in this one, he's coming across a little bit like a dick. He's a little bit angry. In this one,
a dick?
Yeah, a dick or angry. Yeah, that's what they'll say, like from a perceptual bell curve, like why his tonality. See, exactly. So some people,
I mean, I see that, but it's not a dick. It's just, you need to do this.
But it's not about meaning. It's about perception. So like other people, because of vocal aspects of your voice, are thinking it means something else when you just mean it is what it is, right? So it's like, for example, for me, if you said, you know, if I never met you before, if I never knew you before and I met you and I was like, hey, Dan, like, it's so good to be on this podcast. And I said it like that, to me, that doesn't reflect my sort of enthusiasm or honor to talk to you. To you,
right, not at all. Let's say something like, it sounds almost like you're shy.
It's like I'm shy, or like I'm weird.
Almost like in awe, or like,
exactly. So, but see, that was so interesting. So that range that I displayed to you, you quickly identified. But when I talked about the other range of like assertion or like anger, you're like, why is he a dickhead? So it might just be a calibration of certain domains of emotion or certain domains of communication that are the problem, not all of them. So like this stuff is so specific and it's treated not specific enough. Like it's kind of like poker. Like if you look at someone's database over millions of hands, you could be like, hey, like you don't know how to play mid pairs. Like you're losing a ton of money there. Right. But we don't have these kind of things in communication.
Is that being angry? Like, I was saying, like, it wasn't that the first tone, I just didn't interpret it as angry. It could be looked at like that way, but it definitely, I would think it's just assertive. It's like, you need to do this. Like, this is a command kind of thing.
Some people in corporate cultures would be like, you can't talk to people like that. Like, you just simply can't talk to people like that. Yeah.
I think this is overly sensitive, dude. Like, you kind of have to.
But see, that's the whole interesting thing, right? Like the whole beautiful thing is I mean, you're more entrepreneurial. You're a poker player. You've done all your own things. But if you're in a culture where 90% of the people have this expectation that you should be a certain way, when you're not that way, it's tough. It's hard. You get like socially ostracized. You get, oh, this person's different. This person's this person's that. So, but I ultimately believe that the most efficient teams are ones that don't over index on the bullshit like that. Like they don't 100%. Look at the tone. They're just like, oh, he just said this, get it done. Like, and in some ways it makes humans less efficient at what's going on, right? Like, and they're focusing on the wrong things and making meaning out of things that don't really mean anything.
I totally agree. I think that's really what the issue is. And by the way, it's good you brought this up because I want to address an issue that I clearly see that could happen in dating or in these corporate environments, which is, literally I was watching and listening to someone saying to talk in such an authoritative manner. And the manner in which it could have been said could have totally come off as abrasive to a lot of women if like they interpret it as anger, or even to a lot of like sensitive dudes. And like if someone was to not communicate that, it would lead to a lot of issues. And it would disrupt whatever it would be. But from the other person's perspective, they're trying to like do things in an efficient manner and communicate effectively, and they have lots of valid reasons for doing that. And so, in my opinion, as you said, the way to solve this is to not index this person as like weird or different or whatever, but rather to like try to see where they're coming from.
Yeah, 100%. Unfortunately, most people are not in that conversation, which is why like the most effective communicators have the most range. So they could alter their voice, their tone, their posture, their behavior to fit the dynamic that they need. So if they're on a date and they just said something and they offended the person, they could be like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that. Like they could clean up the interactions. And if they need to motivate a team, they could change aspects of their vocal range, tonality, words per minute, all that to motivate. But all it is just perceptions. Like it's just this perceptual, I call it the perceptual bell curve. Like this was fascinating. Like if I could take like 4 videos of 4 people saying the same exact thing, and I could show them to 50,000 people and have you rate who's the most confident, 1, 2, 3, 4, just to have them do that task. And it's insane how reliable that probably will be, where this person's perceived as confident and this person isn't. And the truth is, all it is just information that's being interpreted a certain way. Like, we don't know that person's history. We don't know that person's life. We don't know what they've done. And this is what a con artist is incredible at, right? They can mimic the perceptual bell curve. So you think that they actually are that thing. Like con artists are world class at this.
So do you have courses that teach people, I think you have courses to teach people how to be better communicators in the work environment, which I think is very interesting, by the way. So we'll lead up to another subject. But do you also have courses to teach people like the way of socializing in America and in other cultures, and also like how autistic are you test? I'm curious to see like how, I don't think I'm perceived as that autistic these days, but I'm not sure. But I'm curious to see what the communication skills would look like. Huh?
I have a program called The Social Edge, which is a year long, and it's like a deep dive into social interactions. And then when you're in the course, you have conversations with other people, and our software breaks down the conversation. So you'll like this. This is the most telling question. So after you have a conversation with someone, you're asked the question, on a scale from 1 to 5, how likely are you to invite this person to a dinner with your closest 5 friends? And 5 being definitely, 1 being definitely no. And then we have them articulate why, right? Like that kind of thing. But like with you specifically, it's like, you have a halo effect. Like all I need to say is like, oh, you, in your introduction, you could say, oh, my name is, Dan Cates, aka Jungle Man. I'm like one of the world's best poker players. I've been around for da-da-da-da. Like that allows them to contextualize your behavior differently and makes you so interesting because it's scarce that it can compensate for any behavioral stuff. Like this is where it gets so dynamic, right? Like, and so just fucking fascinating.
That situation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to do it. That would be
in that situation, but
but
I get in lots of situations where that's not the case.
Yeah, where you can't lean on poker, sure. Right? Like you can't. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've been in the interesting situation to view things from multiple different angles. For example, actually, one funny thing is in certain dating cultures, I do much better than in others. That's been, and I think, to be honest, that there are some factors that people are not addressing, and like what the successes are with that. It'd be really interesting to run some studies for how various dating cultures respond and what really the problems are, because there's some big problems in today's situations. I just find I find my performance to be very disparate. Some places I do very bad, or pretty bad, I should say. Never really very bad, but other places I do very well. What's
so interesting too is like, how do you measure dating success, right? Like you have a first date. Is it the second date? Is it sex? Is it a long-term relationship? Is it the feedback from the other person? It's like, it's an interesting question. Our first study ever was on dating. You know that? Ever. So in New York City,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't say it much, but like, first date, we did this thing called the first date files. It was like, I'm 39, so it was like 16 or 17 years ago, where we rented a restaurant in New York City, and we had people do blind dates. So we did a series of like 12 blind dates. And one of the most interesting things about that little thing was the most non-traditional first date discussion ended up being the best date. In the sense that they talked about topics that you're not supposed to talk about. They, self-disclosed a lot. And that was like, I think they had like a second or third date after that. And then there was some where it was just raw attraction. Like the girl just found the guy attractive and the guy found the girl attractive, and it was like gonna work out. But their conversation, I don't think was that great. But we have like all these recorded. It's really cool.
I would like to see a breakdown of that, or rather, can you give a breakdown of that? Because to be honest, there's been lots of situations where it felt like, to be honest, that the attraction trumped a lot of other things, and it was just very, very hard to recover from that if it wasn't there. But I think that personally, that probably people have different strategies of sorts for how they partner with people, so it's going to vary quite a bit. Yeah. And I would think also that the degree to which someone reveals something to you, how attracted they are is going to affect that a lot. If they feel very attracted to you, they're far more likely to disclose. If they feel like they're physically attracted to you, is what I'm saying. If they feel like you're a sexy person or whatever, they're far more likely to disclose something to you. But I think, did you look into the correlation of that? Because it's also kind of tough to like start off in an awkward conversation or a weird topic.
I didn't look at that specifically. I think that the problem with dating is there's like all these like themes, these like invisible themes in dating. Like I'll tell you, so when I was younger, I went on a date with this girl, and she texted me and she was like, hey, I'm so sorry, I'm going to be like 10 minutes late. Right. And I texted back. I was like, no worries. And then she came like 50 minutes late. Right. So I'm in the restaurant.
50 or 15?
50. So she comes in.
That's a little off.
Yeah, a little off. She comes in 50 minutes late, and she just like sits down and she's like, so sorry I'm late. Right. Like, but didn't really seem like it cared. Right. So I remember saying, it was a bold move, but it really worked. I was like, listen, like, I really like you. I really like our initial discussion, but like, I run my life in a tight ship. Like, I am very rarely late for anything right now. And like, the fact that you were just like blasé about that 50 minutes, like I sat here for 50 minutes, like I had like a genuine discussion about the impact that her behavior had on me. But what was so fascinating is in that dynamic, in that male to female dynamic, it was like, she liked me way more because I was willing to sort of assert myself and call that out and show that like I have value and I have a lot of things going on in my life, and just like, don't come late, like, or let me know the context. And it's like, but the way I delivered it is what let that. If I were to just be like, listen, lady, like, you never come late to me on a date again. Like, how dare you do this? Right. I did it from a place of like compassion and understanding and just reasonableness. And that's why there's this sort of like calibration on how you deliver messages.
Oh, for sure. That makes lots of sense to me. I would say that stuff like that has variegated success in my personal experience. Yeah. But what do I know? Like, perhaps people thought I came off as angry or something when I wasn't, or it just didn't matter, like, whatever it was. But I could see how, like, a discussion like that could lead to all kinds of avenues.
Oh, yeah.
That are a lot better than, like, basic small talk. Let's put it. It makes quite a bit of sense. And you set a boundary, too. So that's nice. Yeah, it'd be really interesting if you guys were doing more studies on that. Could you, what sort of things were you able to find? Were there any, like, specifics of what you're able to find? I mean, also, by the way,
in the dating, you mean, specifically?
Yeah. One thing is, at least on dating apps, personality was correlated heavily with attractiveness. But maybe that changes a bit when you get to know someone a bit more with a bit more exposure. And I wonder if this showed up in your studies, or I think you said you didn't really measure for that.
No, we didn't really measure that. Like, what I was really looking at, and to do something like that, you want like a huge amount of studies. Like, you want like, you want like to give everybody like a battery of personality inventories and then have them go on like multiple dates with multiple people and do that. And I didn't have the technical skills to do that. Now I do. So like, our software can analyze everything. So that's what's so cool about it is like I could scale a dating study now and have like a bunch of people go on random first dates online and scale it. But doing it in person, it's tough because you got to like set up cameras and deal with logistics and do all that stuff. Like right now, people are having conversations on our platform as I talk to you and they're getting analyzed. That's more conversational dynamics, but there's a dating component to it too, in the sense that like, I think what's cool is like, if you could take out, it's like presentations. People view presentations to be something wildly different, which is what gives them social anxiety. And which makes it like nerve wracking. I feel like dating's the same thing. Like if you could just show up to a date like you normally show up, like this is what I found for me personally. Like when I was younger, my anxiety was correlated with how attractive the person was. So like if they were attractive, I would get anxious and like be worried. And then I thought to myself, it's like, I don't know anything about this person. Like all I know is that they're attractive. Like they can be an asshole. They could not have the same values as me. There's so many things more. And I started to like devalue attraction, which allowed me to show up more like myself, which led to better dating performance. I think a lot of it is a byproduct of just self-expression and showing up in the way that you want to sort of show up. And the truth is, if you try to show up as somebody that you're not on a first date, good luck holding that up. Because what are you going to do? Like all of a sudden, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, during first year of marriage, they're like, oh, wow, you're a completely different person than I thought you would. Like you don't want to mask too much, right? Like it's kind of it's an interesting dynamic.
It would be interesting to see if, I mean, that's somewhat related. I know that for the workplace, there's a few things that are comparable to the dating situation. I would like to know to what extent the first impressions were useful for dating, because I know that for the for hiring, they only really mattered, they were only really something like 33% accurate, or it mattered for like 33% roughly of the overall hiring decision. It's one of those two possibilities. I'm wondering to what extent this applies for dating. I would think it's like a similar number.
I would say initial impression or first impressions are way more implicit in dating dynamics. Because listen, a lot of people don't have the skill sets to look at the world empirically. Like they're just not used to it. They're not going to say like, oh, this guy, maybe he just had a bad day and he didn't sleep, and that's the reason why. They're just going to over-index on specific things that happen in the initial environment. And it kind of, what happens is it colors your lenses for how you see the other person. And I would expect, and because dating is work is too correlated with performance, and you don't need to necessarily like someone to perform, but we're in a dating dynamic, impressions are so related to how you like someone and see someone and so on and so forth. And also, like I've heard in like our petty society, some people will just say certain things like, oh, like this is what he said in the first 10 minutes. And I'm like, so like, why does that even matter? Like you just said one word and it's changing your whole perspective. Like that's weird. But there's a lot of people that are like that. Right. So it's kind of, it's like, how do you find or how do you set up dates with the people that are maybe more conscious of this stuff and more forgiving and more deeper as people? It could be you got to work on your game selection for dating and find the right games to play in.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a big question. How the hell do you filter for those people? To be fair, it is a filtering mechanism, but also how do you cultivate people to, I mean, I would argue, to be honest, that if people have those issues like that, it's just straight up like a wound. It's just straight up like, it's like something you have to get over, if you know what I mean. It's not even really a personal preference, or it's certainly not a very self-serving one. It's kind of like, I mean, I guess I'm being a little bit judgmental actually, but it's definitely something that you might want to look at. Let's put it that way. If you have like a lot of those things.
And it's definitely something that makes people's lives better. Like if you could view, like, do you know how, this is why I hate these stupid body language things. Like, oh, like if somebody scratches their nose, they're lying. It's like, no, sorry. There's no research for that. Like, and the research that they are making, if you actually read the studies, it's a big leap in logic. It's sad that somebody could be on a date with someone and really enjoy the conversation, and then he or she scratches their nose and be like, oh my God, are they lying to me? Is there something not there? Like it's kind of sad, right? Like you need to spend more time learning about people, knowing them, and not just making these split-second deductions that an entire person's life just by how they answered a question in 5 minutes. It's like kind of silly.
I want to ask a question. Do you have courses that help people? I feel like I've asked a similar question. Do you have courses that help people become better in the workplace, but also better in dating and connecting with people? Because I think, if I recall correctly, you do.
Yeah.
And I wonder if those processes are similar or not. Because to me, it seems like these processes are these worlds should be very similar. They're not as similar as as they appear to be.
They are very similar in the beginning phases and then get different. So for example, like our program, the Social Edge, is 12 phases. If I were to make a business leaning course, the first 8 phases of those would be the same. The difference is just understanding the landscape of a business dynamic and the landscape of what it is to lead in the current culture right now. And what are the demands of a leader? Like that, I wouldn't put in the traditional course, but they're very similar. Like social dynamics, if you approach, it's kind of like this, like when you learn to play mixed games, different variations are different, but like if you're a competent Hold'em player that starts to move into PLO, you're going to use some of the decision-making frameworks in the way that you think about the game and carry it over. I feel like it's the same thing for any social dynamic. So like whether it's a speech, whether it's a presentation, whether it's dating, whether it's leadership, like these are all predicated on foundational skill sets, which is like the ability to read others and read the cultural norms and the social dynamics, the ability to control your own behavior and have range. And then third, the ability to sort of understand more deeply the mechanics of human interactions and sort of what binds us together. Like that's like going to help everything.
So what are some examples of things that you teach people in workplaces or teach? You teach, I presume you help leaders, but you also help, I guess you have to be a bit of a leader to seek you out. And you also help people who just want to communicate in general, like just random employees as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a difference. Like to be a leader, you have to, go ahead.
Yeah. The difference is usually like when I deal with very senior leadership, I have more time constraints for what I can tell them. So most of what I'm doing with senior leaders is like trying to quick fix behavior. So like, I'll give you an interesting story. I worked with this guy years ago that he got in corporate cultures. They do these things called 360 assessments where everybody gives feedback about you. So you sort of understand what the 360 perspective is on you. And his was one of the worst 360s I've ever read. It was just like, this guy doesn't care about me. This guy is rude. He was just a savage. And then 2 people said like all these bad things too, but they were like, but he has made a fundamental change in my career. And I did this exercise with him where I was like, I want you to imagine your funeral. Like everybody you've ever worked with is like saying stuff about you. Like, what are they saying? And usually when you do this with people, people say things like, he was a great boss, or she was amazing, she was inspiring. He goes, I want them to all say he was the toughest hard ass I've ever worked for, but he changed my career. And I was like, is that really what you want your perception to be? He was like, yes. So all we did to sort of fix it is at the level of hiring, he would tell people, he would say, listen, people have told me that I'm short, that I demand excellence, that I'm unreasonable, that I'm all these things. But I promise you, if you work here, I will fundamentally change the trajectory of your careers if you can make it for 2 years. It'll be hard. It'll be tough, but you will learn more than you've ever learned with any other leader. And just by changing that, people saw his behavior as being for them, not at them. And it changed his landscape.
That's interesting.
So I'm like, with senior leaders, I'm looking for like quick fixes. Like my program is like a PhD in social interactions. They're not going to go through the hundreds of videos and assignments. They don't have the time. So I have to find sort of these quick fixes and then I audit them. So I watch every single meeting that they're in and I'll be like, you can't, like, we got to clean this up. We got to do this. We got to do that. Like I help them calibrate, kind of like an eye in the sky, for leadership. But yeah, it's been great. I love it.
I would think that there's quite a lot of value in correcting a lot of more like flaws in personality. I would think that, this guy, you picked a brilliant quick fix, actually, a perfect quick fix, which I'm surprised that worked so well, matter of fact. I would think that the real change, though, that would be long-term beneficial is to somehow get through to this guy or work on whatever it is that makes him such a hard ass. Like, it seems like you don't have to push people to the point where they're pissed off at you to get them to do things. I would think that you do so, but with compassion, right? I mean, isn't that a thing?
Yeah. So we call it, I call this, it's too long to go into. I call it Blake's 3 body problem, which is like, it's where you are now, how you're perceived, how you want to be perceived. And there's like kind of like 3 paths there. The first one is this, just like sometimes there's a behavioral blind spot. Like sometimes people don't know their behavior is giving off the wrong impression. And I tell them, and it's quick fix. And then the second thing is like a transformation, which is what you're talking about, right? Like really, the problem is under my constraints, I can't transform. So for example, like if I was about to go play some crazy heads up cash game and I'm like, Dan, like I'm playing this person, like, do you have anything you're not going to be like, well, Blake, we need to look at your entire game and your decision making process. You're probably going to give me like whatever the quickest thing is, like, oh, that guy like overbets light or something, like look out for that. Like you're just going to give me what
I might give.
I'm curious what you would actually do. Yeah.
It depends on a lot. So sometimes the answer is actually simply don't fold to them. Really, in some situations, it's great to just have the strategy of don't fold. Like,
no, it's perfect. But
I might say something like that.
That's like a big adjustment, right? Like, because that's going to yield the highest level of results for me in that moment. But there's probably a lot of other aspects of my game that I need to work on, right? So it's the same thing. Like,
sure.
So my favorite thing in life is taking people through more of a transformation. But that's not most business leaders. That's just not what I can do. And every once in a while, some of them are fully open for that. But usually these people are under massive time constraints at the higher level. Like you don't really get that much time.
Can't you I would think that the way to do this, and this is how I personally try to do it, is weave it into my schedule and like
that's what I do.
Slowly weave in.
Yeah. So there we
go. So
we have behavioral conditioning software. I built this thing called SkinnerBot that like texts people at random intervals throughout the day. And it's like, but then I put it in their calendar. So like before they go through the meeting, there's like a 5-minute exercise that they have to do in the meeting. But the reason why the reason why I speed this up is I see them on the meetings, and then every meeting I give one piece of feedback that I have to do for the next meeting, and then it starts to compound and stack. But like, I believe that like transformation type stuff, like true transformation stuff, like that requires you to look at your social origin story, your life, how you view the world. It's a lot, potentially some drugs, like, there's, there's a lot of ways. Some drugs in there. Throw some, psilocybin in there. And so,
some like ayahuasca.
It's helpful. Some ayahuasca, which could work too. I mean, people have stuff and it takes some time to sort of work it through.
Yeah, I was thinking it would delve into spirituality, but it appears that many of the spiritual practices are actually...
Yeah. I believe there's so many paths to the top of the mountain. I don't believe there's one path. I believe that there's so many modalities. For some people, doing a vinyasa retreat and not speaking. For other people, doing ketamine assisted therapy with a clinician. To other people, like everybody's got their own sort of path, and you've got to be like curiously interested, or like great development things like Hoffman Institute or something like that. Like there's so many modalities out there. You just got to figure out what works for you.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. Let's firstly, so have you analyzed people who are exceptionally good at charisma and figured out what is it that makes them really good, and then applied this to like, okay, we can help teach you this, such as Bill Clinton, for example, or another example is The Rock. I forget his real name somehow, but he's like notoriously extremely charismatic. Yeah. So, have you done that?
Charisma is a tricky one. So like, first of all, you got to really understand what charisma is. And there's a lot of definitions of what charisma is.
Sure.
So one of the things is People talk about magnetism, like somebody who's charismatic has like a magnetic quality to them where they can walk into the room and people like want to see them. Right? That's exactly. What does that mean? Like, what are we talking about here? So, and that's really what the problem is with like operational definitions of like, quote, like, I don't know what charisma even is. I'm assuming you mean like socially gifted, right? Like people that are just like good with people and people respect them and admire them and they could demand attention and all that.
Actually, that's a really good question. So, first of all, I understand the origins of charisma to actually come from St. Paul, who, because of the way that he spoke, people could see the truth in how he spoke. So he had a very specific kind of charisma.
I never St. Paul.
I need to double check that, but I could have sworn I read that somewhere.
Great. I love that.
It's a very interesting case, but I'm personally very interested in where psychology and spirituality overlap, and also logic and science. That's a bit of my wheelhouse. But in this case, I refer to the capacity to make someone feel very good and manipulate them in a positive way. That's something that is very interesting to me, and the aspect of manipulation on a grand scale in a positive way, to be clear. Because I think it's possible, but this would be very important for creating a large impact. Actually, the podcast is a version of that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, under that notion, so here's the thing. We can't ever use The Rock as an example of charisma. And the reason why is because of a pervasive theme. He is one of the biggest celebrities in the world. It's too much of a halo effect in terms of what's going on, right? Like, we want to look at like, you go into a coffee shop and you order a cappuccino and you're a little bit frustrated and the person behind the counter handles your frustration in just an incredible way and you feel better after interacting with them. And you're just kind of like,
makes sense.
Like what was going on. And I mean, this is kind of what I based it on. It's like the three Silskets. Like anybody who's got a decent level of charisma has a high capacity for sort of reading a room and processing the norms of a room. And then they have really good control over their body and how it amplifies their message. So it's like they can change their tone, their pitch, their words per minute, their movement. It's kind of like the nuances of like, you know, my wife was upset yesterday and it's just like the way that I touched her that night and put an arm on her shoulder had nuance to it. Like the speed and the way that I pressed and all that to show more compassion. So I would believe that anybody with charisma can amplify the channels of communication way more than the average person. So they can not only like talk about something that they're interested, but it can almost like bleed out that they're really so interested and have all those sort of variabilities. And I think it could be, I think certain people have it naturally, and I think it could definitely be trained aspects of charisma. Like this is all just behavior. That's all it is. And then it's just aggregated by somebody's perception. It's kind of like, I used to teach psychology of cults, and like you see the cult leaders, they're creepy, but they're charismatic in their own way. Every cult leader has that charisma and that charm and all that stuff.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I would think that it could be trained too. It probably isn't very easy though.
No. A lot of feedback loops.
And there's also something to be said for like sometimes you don't even want to like, I don't know. I think there are probably some situations where you want to put people off, if that makes sense. If we're talking about from like a moral standpoint, like sometimes you like don't want to, like you don't want to sabotage like the way of what's good for you almost want to like create a negative reaction in a certain way, if that makes sense. If like someone has done something wrong, so it's not always about like making someone feel good.
You want to be able to tap into the range of what's required in the human experience, right? Like you want to be adaptable and highly dynamic. It's the same exact thing. It's like poker's the perfect example. Like, you know, you want to be able to sometimes play tighter, sometimes play looser, sometimes to be a spat. Like you'll be invited to a private game that, you know, I never forget. I said, I got somebody in, I put somebody in a game last minute and and then I got the text message, what the fuck, never again. Right. And I was like, what happened? And then this kid calls me and he was like, dude, like, thank you so much. Like, you know, I crushed. They're terrible. I was like, what the fuck did you do? Did you just sit there and crush? And he was like, I was like, and I sent him a text message. I said, they said never again. Like, what? I had thought that he knew how to play the game of getting invited to a private game and like being action. And he just sat there and took all their money. Like, and it was just, so it's like a nuance, right? And the more you have range as a player, the more you're able to be like, there's certain, you know this, like there's certain pros that just are never going to get game access because of how they are. Like they're just not going to be invited to certain games, right? So they haven't developed that social range to get it. Like, and this is part of what it means to be a high stakes player, right? So it's very similar in social interactions. Like you got to learn how to assert yourself. You got to learn how to show compassion. You got to learn how to be a good listener. You need everything so that you can use it when you need it.
Yeah, it makes loads of sense. I think it's a really big topic that may even require like its own.
Yeah, we should do another long form podcast on that one. That's like it's a rabbit hole.
I'm happy to actually. Yeah. But I do believe that charisma, as with pretty much anything, can be broken down, and all these behaviors, like you could break down all the different ways to have a positive effect on someone. You could break down how to have compassion and all the different
100%.
Probably most of the permutations of doing this in a smart way, and empathy, and train them, and also to tell jokes. It's a bit more complicated. I find jokes to be a bit more complicated because
jokes are probably like the more harder. Yeah,
I think it's hard partly because you need an element of creativity or like a wealth of things to draw from and a lot of context and stuff like that. It's not just you do this, and that.
Yeah, comedy's really nuanced. Yeah, especially for the listener and delivery, and there's loads of ways to fuck that up, and even like the cultural differences matter to some extent, I think. But yeah, that I find that to be an interesting subject. So I want to go into a couple other things because I know I read that you could detect cheating with some of your psychology that was
analysis.
Honestly, that was just like an obvious spot that I told on a pod. Like sometimes it's just like, it's not just like these deep, dark things. It's just like blatantly obvious. Like put it this way, like guys always, you know, a girl walks by that's attractive. Like we're visual creatures. We'll look, right? Like you'll glance, like even like I'm walking down the street with my wife and a girl walks by and I glance away, right? Like that's it. There are some guys,
not the smoothest,
that are, there are some guys that they're not glancing. They're like desiring, right? So I was having a conversation with this guy. So, you'll get this. So I told this story, but I didn't get into the details. So I met somebody at an event. Me and my wife met someone at an event and I told him that I played poker and he knew about a game on 23rd Street that was big in the real estate thing that I knew that it operated like game/brothel. You know what I mean? Like one of these one of those games. So he brought that up and the way he said it to me, he was like, do you know about that game? Like seeing if like I was one of the, and I was like, yeah, like I know about it. Like I would never go, but like I know what goes on there kind of thing. And then this girl walked by and he was just like this, like really like hungry and looking. And I was like, there's just no way in hell that guy's not a lot of like, if he knows that game and he looks at girls like that in this open dynamic there's no way in hell. And it turned out he was, and then also just little things like I have really high accuracy for like couples. Like it's my wife's game. I remember it was one time we were with this couple and they were being like so over the top with each other. Like, my love, hand this to me, my love, my sweetheart, my darling, like, just like so much. And we left the dinner and my wife was like, they're so cute. I was like, won't last 9 months. Like I said it like it's an offhanded type of thing. It's like, won't last 9 months.
Why?
Like, because it wasn't that I was looking at. It was the conversational dynamics between those two. It was how often they disagreed. It was the fact that when one of them said something, the other person would make them wrong. And they were only like, so there was all of this sweet stuff, but beneath it was a lot of obvious indications of tension and unresolved things. And what's likely to happen for those two couples is they're likely to think, because they use those words and all that stuff, that they're sweet and that it works. But the reality is, as a relationship, they were fundamentally missing parts of, you know, things that lead to more cohesive, just like standard Gottman Institute. You know about John Gottman?
No, I don't know about him.
He's kind of like an OG. Gottman Institute was he's an OG researcher that could predict if couples would stay together with like a 90% accuracy by watching one interaction. And he looked for signs of contempt and things like that. Like contempt was he has this thing called the 4 deadly horsemen, and one of them was contempt. So you never want to have like contempt for your partner.
Doesn't sound, I think I've read that. One big tell of, I don't understand why people do this because it's so obviously bad, but to assign, I don't know I'm trying to think of the term, but basically to defame one's character. To like if someone makes some kind of mistake and then say, oh, you always make this kind of mistake. Like if someone said, you know, just makes a careless mistake and say, oh, you're so clumsy all the time, or you always forget to do this thing for me all the time, when it's not true. It's like kind of an evil statement, basically.
It's like the whole, you just described the whole poker world. You know, somebody sizing in a river and a spot is not good. And they're like, how could you do that? You know?
Well, all those players that do that pay for their mistakes with money. So
and all the other people just talk.
Theirs a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, they pay for their mistakes with having broken relationships over and over, which is unfortunate. This is actually what I'm trying to help solve. Is why are we hurting each other so much? But yeah, I mean, I would think that the theme that you're pointing at, correct me if I'm wrong, is just that there's conflict and these people are not resolving these conflicts. They don't have very good mechanisms for resolving these conflicts, and they try to be sweet over the top of it.
They don't have the awareness, willingness, or tools and mechanisms to do it. So sometimes people just don't want to deal with those kind of things. Those are the tougher conversations, you know?
Right.
And sometimes when you see that much of an inconsistency in people, it's like, it's probably not going to work.
Right. I believe there's a saying, like, a saying with that, where there's peace without justice. Someone said something like, when there's peace without justice, is not peace at all. I forget who said that.
That's great. Russian?
I need to get the exact quote.
Sounds like a Russian quote.
It was actually some lady that said it. It was a woman philosopher. And I have to find it, but I found it and I thought like that quote. It's not true peace. Basically.
It's so true. It's like the concept of like completion, like being complete. So like my dad passed from ALS like like almost a year from now, like in November. And which was a horrible disease and a horrible thing to watch people go through. But like when he died, I was complete. And the reason why is me and him had all the conversations. Like, and he was literally talking to me with like eye gazing technology, like spelling it out on a keyboard. But like, I let my dad know like how much I loved him. I let my dad know, like, is there anything that you want me to do? How he made a remarkable like change in my life. I said all that, and I was like crying hysterical as I did it.
Oh, really?
But I said all that so that when he died, I didn't have anything left that was like, I wish I would have said that to my dad. Or I wish I didn't do that. And it made his death so much easier because of that.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool. That's good to know.
Yeah, so like you can do this everywhere.
Perhaps
get complete with
Does this perhaps have something to do with writing as well? Because I read somewhere that that writing is very helpful for... I read somewhere that you mentioned that you valued the power of writing.
I think writing is...
a relationship there.
Writing is one of the single most effective self-reflection, personal development tools out there. It's also probably one of the best ways for people that are very like thinkers and in their head, like a lot of poker players are. Like if you're anxious about something or if you're worried about something, you're never going to win the war in your head because there's no checks and balances in your head. Like it's just like loops and loops and loops. Writing it out on paper makes it so sort of different. Yeah, I have a commitment. I write 2,750 words every single day without fail. Even when I'm like sick and throwing up, I make sure I write that no matter what.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. It inspires me to write a bit more. Maybe there's something to this and can help
Oh
to
yeah,
get.
I think
there's
you'd
some.
actually be a pretty good writer too. Just like the way that you articulate certain phrases and statements. You probably find writing just comes natural to you in a lot of ways.
That's a good read. I am a pretty good writer, as it turns out.
Yeah,
I get compliments of my writing quite a bit.
That makes a lot of sense.
I may try it for some of those like loops in my head that don't seem to close. Like maybe I can help close them.
That's what I do. I just, as soon as I start, like, if I'm worried about something or whatever, I immediately just start writing. That's how I resolve it.
All right. So a couple last questions before we wrap things up. Do you have any? I think I saw that you were on another podcast and that you had suggestions for someone to give better questions. Do you have any suggestions for me for better questions?
No, I actually
seems
think
part of your.
I think these questions were good. I think that like for you, I think that you definitely kind of like light up or are more intrigued. I think my thing would be is like follow your passions. Like using questions is like whatever you're genuinely interested in, ask those questions. You know what I mean? Like I think that's a really good way of doing things. What else? I mean, that's a whole thing, like a whole phase on how to ask questions and structure questions. And I guess it's tricky though. Like what game are you playing? Like the questions, if I had a podcast, the questions that I would be trying to ask are the ones that never been asked before by that person. So it's like you hit them and they're like, oh wow, I've never been asked that before. So stepping outside of what they normally were asked, and you've asked me a couple questions I never been asked before, so I think you did good there.
Yeah, sometimes it's a bit of a mix for me, but I personally like to find the interesting pieces of the things that where like there's clearly something that can be practically applicable to people's lives. I'm a bit about practicality, you can say. Not so much about, I'm a bit interested in some theory stuff, but you could go on and on forever about theory as a thing. And at what point does it actually like make your life better?
Yeah, totally.
That's usually how I orient things. I also want to know, you were saying that you had some live tell stuff about me or some insights into some behaviors?
All I had was, I think this is pre-2019. So it's pre-COVID, or maybe it is 2019. I'm not saying who, but one of my clients you were in a mixed game with, and you didn't come up a ton. But the one note that I checked before the podcast was like, check Jungle's hands. After, like I said, I think it was like 6 to 8 hours, you get a little sloppier. And you were sort of like, telegraphing like, nah, sure, I'll play this hand. Like, why not? Like when you were more marginal than when you were top of range.
Oh, really? Oh, that's good to know. I didn't know that. I could see that happening. Yeah. It's a real subtle one. Like, holy shit.
The issue is, I had a hard time. Like, I ended up not focusing on you because it was going to be too difficult because this was in mix. So it's just, you treat a PLO hand different, and I think it was like 10 game or whatever, like the big mix game. So it's harder to figure out your individual patterns when you're playing mixed variants. It's much easier if you're just playing like Hold'em. Yeah,
someone's coming after me. Holy shit!
You were never a target. I was kind of disappointed. I thought I would have more, and also like I mean I know a little bit about, but like you're like a poker high stakes vagabond. Like you travel so much. So like your reliability in a game isn't so high. Like it's not like you're going to play in that game every single time it runs. Right. So like I look at things like this, like if Jungle's not going to be in this game, we're not going to focus on him because there's no point. Like why are we going to do that? So I've never really gone any deeper with you.
Do you have any other reads? I don't know to what extent you can reveal things, but do you have any other last reads or things that you've discovered from players for high stakes?
Oh, I mean, I can't reveal anything, important. But I have mountains. So I have like little things on everyone. I'll give you one that I could reveal because I said it publicly and I told them. So, it was on Espen. So, when he played the main event, I was working for Adrian, who they were heads up with, right? And one of the problems was I was so focused on Espen's hands because he kept using his little stupid Mario thing on his cards. I was trying to reverse engineer that. And then at last minute, I found like almost perfectly correlated display of his facial expressions, specifically his smirk or smile when in spots. And I found it at last minute, and I ended up showing him and laughing about it. And now he doesn't do it. But that was one of the biggest, highest yield things that I found at too late because it was so interesting. So he would do this thing where when he was like, I don't remember exactly the order. I think it was when he was bluffing, he was like pensing his lips, like pulling his lips together, like, and then when he was good, he was like, his lips were full, and that was it. Now,
really?
that doesn't happen for everyone, but it was subtle and specific to him. And then there's a couple, what other ones did I publicly say?
All right, one more.
There's so many. I mean,
if you found.
I'm trying to think. I'll happily tell you if it's not recorded, but it's just when it's recorded. I don't want everybody to know.
Okay,
I get in trouble.
Don't say.
Yeah,
if you can't.
I won't say. I don't like. Yeah,
no trouble.
Don't want to kill the business there.
We're more about peace. We're not about trouble.
Yeah, we're not about trouble here.
Not trying to hurt the business, trying to help the business. All right, Blake, thank you for your time.
Thank
you.
Blake
Eastman, everybody, the founder of Nonverbal Group. Check it out if you're trying to read people's souls.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time, Blake.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.